So let me start by saying thank you to our hosts. Every author writes for an audience, and it's wonderful to have a Spanish-speaking audience for the third edition of Globalizing Capital. This book has something of a history, as I will describe, as well as describing a history of the international monetary system. It covers the better part of 2 centuries, the gold standard in the 19th century, the troubled period of monetary instability between World Wars I and II, the Bretton Woods system in the third quarter of the 20th century, and the post-Bretton Woods international monetary non-system. The second and third editions of the book added a discussion of the euro and the early 21st century, after which we had a decade of crises, starting with the global financial crisis, covered in the new chapter 7, appended to the third edition. And I can't resist the temptation to show you how the cover has evolved over those 3 editions. You can see the young Chinese boy. This was rather prescient, anticipating the role of China in the international monetary and financial system in 1998. Well, the young boy had grown to manhood by 2008 here in the second edition, and mirroring China's own demographics, you can see that he is rather elderly, although still studying his financial newspaper. So I can't cover this in entire 2 centuries of history in a few minutes. What I would like to do instead is to commemorate or mark the fact that we are currently observing the 50th anniversary of the end of the Bretton Woods system. The curtain was rung down on Bretton Woods, if you will, on August 15th, 1971, exactly 50 years ago, at Camp David by President Richard Nixon, who you can see here in the middle, surrounded by his economic brain trust. Immediately to Nixon's right is his Treasury Secretary, the Texan John Connally, who famously remarked, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem," an observation that is still current in 2021. To Connally's right is the chairman of the Fed, Arthur Burns, who was notorious for arguing that monetary policy had nothing to do with inflation, and the Federal Reserve couldn't do anything to tame the growing inflation problem. To Nixon's other side is the late, great George Shultz, then Secretary of Labor. Shultz's face betrays the fact that he wasn't so happy evidently about the discussions going on at Camp David. And I think the last gentleman here to Nixon's left is Paul McCracken of the Council of Economic Advisors. The Bretton Woods system was special. The Bretton Woods Monetary Conference in 1944 was the one time in history when a global monetary system emerged in whole cloth, in other words, emerged fully formed out of an international negotiation. So prior changes in international monetary relations and institutions were ad hoc, or the accumulation of a set of separate national decisions. And the same has been true of the international monetary non-system that followed Bretton Woods starting in the 1970s. That Bretton Woods was different reflected special circumstances. It reflected the fact that 1944 was the United States' unipolar moment when it was far and away the dominant international monetary and financial power, at least of what we then called the free world. And it could heavily shape the course of negotiations. There existed in 1944 what political scientists refer to as an epistemic community. In other words, a community of experts who broadly agreed on the desirable form of the post-war monetary order. And in 1944, World War II was still underway, making it urgent that the countries assembled at Bretton Woods reach an agreement sooner or later. The 30 years that followed the Trente Glorieuses, the French are fond of saying, was a period of rapid economic growth. In the advanced economies, economic growth faster than in any comparable period before or since. So the coincidence of rapid growth and Bretton Woods encourages the belief that there was something special and something causal about the effects of Bretton Woods, favorable effects of Bretton Woods on the global economy. You know, all of this is to say that there will be no new Bretton Woods monetary conference in our future, that the very special circumstances that allowed Bretton Woods to succeed will be difficult, if not impossible, to replicate in the 21st century. Our world, therefore, and our international monetary system clearly are different, although there is dispute over how different. So there are some authors, such as Reinhardt and Rogoff, whose recent article I reproduce here on the right, who say the current international monetary non-system is not all that different, actually, from Bretton Woods. Exchange rates were not flexible under Bretton Woods, but they're not all that flexible today. Capital controls on international capital flows were widespread under Bretton Woods, but many emerging markets, including China, retain consequential capital controls today. The US dollar was the dominant international currency under Bretton Woods, and it remains far and away the dominant international and reserve currency today. So that's one view. My view is otherwise. I would argue that our current international monetary system does differ significantly from Bretton Woods. First of all, we have had the wholesale removal of capital controls by developed or advanced economies, making their financial situation entirely different from Bretton Woods. While some emerging markets retain capital controls, the rise of capital mobility toward and affecting emerging markets has been significant relative to the third quarter of the 20th century. The post-Bretton Woods period has seen a sharp increase in the share of emerging markets and in the share of the world's population living under democratic and republican political systems. And a central argument of globalizing capital is that political democracy creates pressure for capital account liberalization and for directing policy at goals other than simply stabilizing the exchange rate. It's no longer possible to simply subordinate monetary policy to the imperatives of exchange rate flexibility. So there is the need for greater exchange rate flexibility than in earlier periods of more limited political democracy like the gold standard era. There's a need for greater exchange rate flexibility today. So there you have in one slide the argument of globalizing capital. The collapse of Bretton Woods also had a number of unanticipated consequences. Number one, it gave rise to what international monetary economists refer to as the Musa puzzle, after Mike Musa, the University of Chicago professor and longtime chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, was first to observe. Musa observed that along with greater nominal exchange rate variability following the collapse of Bretton Woods came greater real exchange rate variability or volatility. So for University of Chicago professors who think that money is neutral and that it shouldn't affect the real economy, this was something of a puzzle. If you're more Keynesian inclined, like I tend to be, then it's not so much of a puzzle that money is non-neutral and that greater nominal exchange rate flexibility translates into greater variability of relative prices and therefore of resource allocation. So you see here in this vertical line before Bretton Woods and after Bretton Woods, I show you the real exchange rate, the relative price of imports and exports, if you will, and you can see how it became much more volatile after the collapse of Bretton Woods. Reassuringly, we didn't also see a negative effect of that volatility on trade, perhaps because of the development of hedging instruments and hedging markets with which importers and exporters could protect themselves from this volatility. A second surprise following the collapse of Bretton Woods was that the expected decline in the demand for international reserves did not materialize. And to the contrary, we saw an even more rapid increase in the demand by central banks and governments for foreign reserves, mainly dollar reserves, but foreign reserves more broadly. And you can see from the figure on the right that the recent rise has been dominated by China, by other emerging markets in Asia, the black line, and to a lesser extent by Japan, all of which recognized that countries needed more reserves to neutralize the effects of capital flow surges, which were growing larger and larger with the passage of time. Some economies accumulated reserves in the course of intervening in the foreign exchange market to prevent their currencies from appreciating. That is the so-called mercantilist motive, in order to maintain their export competitiveness, in other words. And the Asian crisis led to widespread adoption of what is called the Greenspan-Guidotti rule after the central banker and Argentine finance minister who first pointed to the idea that central banks should hold enough reserves to finance any current account deficit and pay off all the short-term debt that might mature over the course of the coming year. And you can see that central banks took that to heart, especially after the Asian financial crisis. Here. A third surprise was that the move to greater exchange rate flexibility was less than generally expected. So I should offer a mea culpa here. I was among those who thought that due to the rise of capital mobility and the spread of political democracy, countries in general would move in the direction of freer floating. And you can see that only a minority of global GDP, I'm showing you shares of global GDP in the figure on the right, countries accounting only for a minority, maybe a third of global GDP, have moved to free floating. The others continue to maintain fixed exchange rates or operate crawling pegs or managed floats. So my earlier view had been that countries would move to the poles, the extremes. That's why it's called the bipolar view of hard pegs or free floats. And you can see that a significant fraction on the order of countries accounting for half of global GDP have not moved to one pole fixed rates or the other pole freely floating rates. So my childhood friend, Jeffrey Frankel, who teaches this material at Harvard University, has an article entitled "No One Exchange Rate Regime is Right for All Countries at All Times." And I think that point is borne out by this figure. A fourth surprise was that the insulating properties of flexible exchange rates turned out to be less than anticipated. So early models and early policymakers thought that with the transition to flexible exchange rates, economies would be fully insulated from foreign shocks from shocks to export competitiveness coming from abroad. They would be fully insulated from shocks to financial markets coming from abroad. And that turned out not to be correct. It turned out not to be true. Reason being that early models like the Mundell-Fleming model of the open economy with flexible exchange rates had an underspecified and underdeveloped financial sector. And when you specified the financial sector more fully, as Steve Ternovsky did in the 1970s in this famous article on the right, you discover that insulation from foreign shocks due to flexible exchange rates is incomplete. Still, recent work like that by my Berkeley colleague Maury Obstfeld confirms that insulation from foreign shocks is greater under flexible exchange rates than pegged rates. It's simply that insulation simply is not complete under flexible rates. A fifth and final surprise was that the Triffin dilemma did not disappear following the collapse of Bretton Woods. So the Triffin dilemma was that the U.S. did not have enough gold to provide international reserves, safe and liquid U.S. Treasury bonds to be held as international reserves to the rest of the world all by itself indefinitely, because the U.S. government had a fixed amount of gold and it couldn't convert those Treasury bonds into gold as the stock of Treasury bonds held by foreign monetary officials rose indefinitely. In the 21st century, we have a closely related variant of the Triffin dilemma, which is that as the rest of the world grows relative to the United States, as it should, given the logic of catch-up and convergence, and foreign governments and central banks hold more and more U.S. treasuries as reserves, the U.S. government isn't going to be able to raise the revenues sufficient to pay off all that debt on demand indefinitely all by itself going forward, meaning that other sources of safe and liquid international reserves are going to have to step up over time. So there is this tension pointed to by the Triffin dilemma between our increasingly multipolar world where the U.S. accounts for a shrinking share of global GDP and our still dollar-dominated international monetary non-system. In addition, this tension has a geopolitical aspect to it as well. There's the impression that the United States is becoming a less reliable geopolitical partner, first under Trump and maybe now still under Biden. And there is evidence, which I talk about in Globalizing Capital, that governments and central banks hold as reserves the currencies of their alliance partners, their trusted geopolitical partners, as my co-authors and I look at in more detail in this article reproduced on the right. So alternatives to the dollar will have to step up eventually in order to provide the international liquidity that 21st century globalization requires. What alternative? Special drawing rights, the accounting money that the International Monetary Fund issues. There is no private or commercial use of special drawing rights. Exporters don't invoice or settle their cross-border transactions using SDRs. Banks don't borrow abroad in SDRs. The SDR basket made up of 5 national currencies is no bank or firm's natural habitat. They prefer to do business in their own domestic currency, and failing that, they do business in the dollar. And I think, and so long as banks and firms are not doing business in SDRs, central banks, which hold reserves in order to act as lenders of last resort to those banks and firms with dollar liabilities, banks and firms are not doing business in SDRs, central banks won't hold reserves in the form of SDRs. And finally, there's the fact that we need an international lender of last resort when a bad thing happens to the global economy. When Lehman Brothers failed in September of 2008, when the U.S. commercial paper market all but seized up in March of 2020, the de facto international lender of last resort is the Federal Reserve, which has swap lines, dollar swap lines with central banks around the world and can inject a large amount of dollars into the global economy if the need arises. If there's a sudden demand for international liquidity, it can do that over a weekend. The IMF is not empowered to do the equivalent in SDRs over a weekend. As we've seen with the recent SDR allocation earlier this year, it takes many months, even years, to get the agreement of the IMF's shareholders, its member governments, to a new SDR issuance. The IMF is not a government. It doesn't have the power to simply issue more SDRs. So the way I put it is, so long as we have no global government, and we're not going to have one in our lifetimes, the IMF will not have the power to issue more SDRs over a weekend in an emergency. And the SDR will not supplant the dollar and other national currencies in the international monetary system. Other national currencies with big platforms like the euro and the Chinese renminbi. That's what I argued about a decade ago in this other book, that the international monetary system would become tripolar, if you will, with a role for the euro, the renminbi, and the dollar. But there hasn't been much progress in that direction in the intervening decade. The share of international reserves held in euros is the same as it was a decade ago. The share held in Chinese renminbi is up from 0 to 2%. Not much progress in an absolute sense. So that's why I write here, I'll keep arguing that this is going to happen until I'm right. I give you a forecast, larger role for the euro and the renminbi, but I'm not giving you a date as well, that being the first rule of forecasting. What are the obstacles? In the case of the euro, I think the principal obstacle is a shortage of investment grade, AAA rated sovereign debt securities. So there are only 4 AAA rated euro area countries: Germany, France, Netherlands, Austria. If you add up their government bonds, as I've done here, $3 trillion worth or so, that is, as we say in the US, small potatoes compared to $16 trillion worth of US Treasury securities at the end of 2019. So the Europe, and that's the argument of this working paper, which Daniel Gross and I wrote for the European Commission last year. The European Recovery Fund, the 850 euro bond issue backed by the full faith and credit of the European Union as a whole, goes a small way in the direction of correcting this imbalance. But 850 billion euros is a drop in the bucket relative to what are now more like 23 trillion US Treasury bonds outstanding. So there simply aren't enough euros to be held as international reserves. Many of what has been issued are held by Europe's own commercial banks to meet their capital requirements, or have been bought up by the European Central Bank in the course of its asset purchase programs. They're not available to the People's Bank of China or the Bank of Japan or whomever. In the case of the Chinese renminbi, there are capital controls limiting the access to Chinese financial assets by foreigners. But I think the obstacle there is mainly political. Every true international currency in history has been the currency of a political republic or democracy, starting with the Republican city-state of Venice, which I show you at the top, Genoa, Florence, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain in the 19th century, the United States in the 20th, because central bank reserve managers and others value checks and balances on arbitrary action by the executive. They value the fact that the issuing government can't arbitrarily change the monetary rules of the game. So there was talk during the Trump era that central banks might move away from the dollar because Mr. Trump might arbitrarily change the rules of the monetary game and not pay foreign holders of U.S. treasuries or something like that. I think China under President Xi has been moving in the wrong direction of concentrating more power at the top. If they can change the rules of the game for Alibaba and WeChat, why can't they change the rules of the game affecting foreign central banks holding renminbi as reserves? So that's why I don't think Shanghai, shown at the bottom, and the Chinese renminbi will become serious rivals to the dollar in the very short run. It's conceivable that making the People's Bank of China independent of politics, making financial regulators in China independent of politics would be enough to enhance the attractions of the renminbi. But again, I don't see China obviously moving now in that direction. What about cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, central bank digital currencies? In my view, only central bank digital currencies are here to stay. And they will change domestic payments, but they will not change cross-border payments. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are too volatile to be attractive as a form of reserves by very conservative, risk-averse central bank reserve managers. Stablecoins like Tether and US dollar coin, which are ostensibly pegged one-to-one to the actual dollar, the stability of those pegs, I think, is an open question. Tether holds only a fraction of its backing for its stablecoin in the form of liquid assets, high-quality liquid assets. So Tether, and I would argue to an extent US dollar coin, are subject to the same kind of speculative attack problems that have historically collapsed pegged exchange rates. So if stablecoins collapse, they're not going to be attractive as a medium for cross-border payments either. Central bank digital currencies are probably here to stay. The People's Bank of China is already issuing its on a experimental pilot basis. Other central banks like the Fed are going to move much more slowly, if at all. But I think central bank digital currencies are coming, and you will see more payments completed within China using people's smartphones that have an app downloaded from the PBOC site where they have e-yuan in that app or wallet. That's domestic payments, though. What about cross-border payments? China's central bank digital currency can only be used in China. Central banks are exploring ways of making their digital currencies interoperable. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the Central Bank of Thailand, which I show you on the right, have a project called Inthanon Lion Rock, exploring that. But it's a very complicated set of technologies and institutions. Others, like the Bank for International Settlements, imagine a single blockchain, a single platform on which 120 different central bank digital currencies could circulate and be exchanged for one another. But imagine how complicated that would be to design and operate, and importantly, govern. Who would be responsible for making decisions about how it worked? Governance of that system would be immensely more complicated than governance of the World Trade Organization, for example. So I don't think central bank digital currencies will alter the structure of the international monetary system, significantly affect cross-border payments for the foreseeable future. And that is true of China's central bank digital currency, as I said, can only be used when you're in China, can only be used for relatively small retail transactions, not interoperable with other CBDCs, therefore unlikely to change the structure of the international monetary system. So let me conclude by asking, are we better or worse off today than under Bretton Woods? I don't know about better or worse. Economists are better at making positive judgments than normative judgments. But the positive judgment or statement would be, although there is continuity between the Bretton Woods system and what we have today, the current system is significantly different. Today, we have greater capital mobility than under Bretton Woods, fewer controls, more political democracy, and a more multipolar world economy. There's no going back to Bretton Woods, therefore. But the same kind of tensions that afflicted Bretton Woods are evident today. These include the mismatch between dollar dominance and our increasingly multipolar world economy, the 21st century Triffin dilemma, and the fact that we continue to rely on the good offices and the swap lines of a national central bank, the Fed, for global liquidity. I don't see a clear way of relieving these tensions in the short run. All we can do is hope that the euro and the Chinese renminbi will overcome their obstacles and that the Fed will continue to recognize and act on its international responsibilities. So I continue to expect, given these tensions, international monetary and financial turbulence going forward. We've had a crisis roughly once a decade. That's permitted me to do successive editions of this book. Maybe we should look forward, if I have the energy, to another edition in 2028. Thank you very much.